What if I told you that right now, today, in the year we are living in, the government has quietly lifted bans on certain survival skills that your great-grandparents used every single day just to stay alive? Skills that were so powerful, so effective at keeping people self-sufficient, that authorities actually made them illegal or heavily restricted them for decades. And now, without any major announcement, without a single headline on the evening news, those restrictions have been quietly reversed. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's documented history that most people walking around today have absolutely no idea about. Stick with me because in the next 30 minutes, I'm going to walk you through 25 of these forgotten survival tricks from the Great Depression era, why they were banned, what changed, and most importantly, how you can use them today to protect yourself and your family no matter what happens next. I'm your host here at Forgotten Survival Code, and this might be the most important video you watch all year. Now, before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and tap the bell so you never miss a video like this. And if you find any of this useful, give it a thumbs up. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need this information. Okay, let's get into it. To really understand why these tricks were banned in the first place, you have to go back and feel the weight of what the Great Depression actually was. We're talking about October 1929. The stock market collapses overnight. Banks begin failing by the thousands, and within a matter of months, roughly 25% of the entire American workforce has no job, no income, and in many cases, no food on the table. By the early 1930s, soup kitchen lines stretched for city blocks. Families were sleeping in makeshift shacks along riverbanks and railroad tracks. Children were going to school hungry if they went at all. The people who survived that era didn't survive because the government saved them. They survived because they dug deep into human instinct and pulled out survival knowledge that had been passed down for generations. They raised animals in their backyards, they collected rainwater, they preserved food in ways that had been practiced for centuries. They brewed, they fermented, they traded, they bartered, they built, they fixed, and they grew their own medicine. And ironically, as America climbed back out of that hole and prosperity returned, lawmakers began systematically restricting or outright banning many of the very practices that had saved lives during the darkest years. Some of it was about control. Some of it was about protecting industries that didn't want competition from self-sufficient citizens, and some of it was well-intentioned regulation that simply went too far. But here's what's happening now. In the last several years, state by state, county by county, and even at the federal level, many of those restrictions have been rolled back. The right to collect rainwater, to raise backyard chickens, to sell home-produced food, to practice certain traditional remedies, to live off the grid, all of it is being quietly restored in many parts of this country. And the people who know about it are already putting these practices back to work. So let's go through all 25. The first trick is rainwater harvesting. During the Depression, families in dry regions of the American West survived droughts by catching rainwater from rooftops and storing it in barrels and cisterns. It sounds like the most basic human thing imaginable, and it is. But by the mid-20th century, in states like Colorado, Utah, and Washington, collecting rainwater was actually illegal. Water rights laws, which were designed to control the flow of water to agricultural interests in municipalities, classified rainwater as state property the moment it hit the ground, or even before that. Homeowners who set up rain barrels were technically breaking the law. That has changed dramatically. As of today, the majority of U.S. states have either fully legalized rainwater harvesting or significantly relaxed their restrictions. Colorado, which had one of the strictest bans, now allows residential rainwater collection up to 110 gallons. Utah allows up to 2,500 gallons with proper registration. If you haven't looked up your state's current law on this, do it this week, because having an emergency water supply that doesn't depend on municipal infrastructure could save your family's life in a crisis. The second trick is backyard chicken keeping. Go back to the 1930s and you'd find chickens scratching around in yards across America, urban and rural alike. Eggs were protein, feathers were insulation, and a spent hen was a Sunday dinner. As cities grew and zoning laws became more sophisticated through the mid-20th century, chickens were classified as livestock and banned from residential zones in most American cities. For decades, if you lived in a suburb or a city, keeping chickens was simply not allowed. That's reversed. Today, over 400 U.S. cities explicitly permit backyard chicken keeping, including major metropolitan areas like Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, Denver, and Atlanta. Most have restrictions on the number of hens and typically prohibit roosters, but the fundamental right to raise egg-laying hens at home has come back. Depression-era families knew that a small flock of 6 hens could provide enough eggs to feed a family of 4 year-round. That knowledge is just as valid today. The third trick is home food preservation. specifically home canning and fermenting for sale or trade. People in the Depression didn't just preserve food for themselves. They traded preserved goods with neighbors. They sold them at local markets. Home canning was a cottage industry that kept many families financially afloat. Over the years, food safety regulations, while important, created a legal thicket that effectively made selling homemade preserved foods nearly impossible without commercial kitchen certification and licensing. The cost of compliance was prohibitive for small producers. Beginning in the early 2010s and accelerating through the 2020s, cottage food laws began spreading across the country. Today, all 50 states have some form of cottage food law that allows home producers to make and sell certain foods directly to consumers without needing a licensed commercial kitchen. The scope varies widely by state. Some states allow only baked goods. Others allow full lines of fermented and preserved products. If you know how to can, how to ferment, how to make jams and preserves, you now have a legal avenue to turn that skill into income or trade goods. Just like Depression-era families did, the fourth trick is seed saving. This one might surprise you. In the latter half of the 20th century, as agricultural corporations began patenting genetically modified and hybridized seed varieties, seed saving, the ancient practice of collecting and replanting seeds from your harvest, became legally complicated in ways most home gardeners didn't realize. The Depression generation saved seeds as a matter of survival. They kept seed envelopes in their kitchens and their barn rafters. They traded seeds with neighbors. It was how you ensured next year's food before you could even worry about this year's. While patents on commercially developed seeds remain active and apply to farmers using those specific varieties, the legal right to save seeds from open-pollinated and heirloom varieties has been affirmed and protected in most jurisdictions. Organizations dedicated to heirloom seed preservation have helped restore legal clarity. For home survival gardeners, the message is clear. Grow from open-pollinated, non-hybrid seeds, save your seeds every year, and you have a food supply that renews itself indefinitely. This was the foundation of Depression-era food security. The fifth trick is gray water reuse. During the Depression, not a drop of water was wasted. Water used to wash dishes or do laundry was directed to kitchen gardens. This practice, known as gray water recycling, was just how things worked when water was scarce and money was non-existent. By the later 20th century, plumbing codes in most U.S. states treated all wastewater identically. Gray water from your sink had to go into the sewer system, period. Over the past decade, that has changed substantially. States including California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Montana, Florida, and many others have enacted gray water reuse standards that allow homeowners to legally divert sink and laundry water to landscape irrigation. California even has a simple permit pathway for laundry-to-landscape systems. In a prolonged drought or a water shortage scenario, the ability to reuse gray water for your garden could be the difference between your food plants surviving or dying. The sixth trick is wood burning and alternative heating. Depression families heated with wood. They cut their own timber or scavenged fallen wood. They knew how to build and maintain fires efficiently for heat and cooking. As the 20th century progressed, air quality regulations in many urban and suburban areas began restricting or banning the use of wood-burning stoves and fireplaces, particularly during certain air quality alert days. Those regulations still exist in many densely populated areas. But across most of rural and suburban America, the right to heat with wood has been preserved, and in some regions actively encouraged as a renewable energy option. Modern EPA-certified wood stoves are dramatically more efficient and cleaner than Depression-era stoves. Knowing how to heat your home without electricity or natural gas is a survival skill that virtually no one teaches anymore. Depression-era families didn't think of it as survival. They thought of it as Tuesday. The seventh trick is foraging for wild edibles. The Depression generation knew their local landscape the way most people today know their Netflix menu. They knew which plants were edible, which were medicinal, which were poisonous. Dandelion greens went in the salad. Wild garlic went in the soup. Elderberries went in the preserves. Pokeweed, correctly prepared, went on the supper table. Foraging laws in the United States became increasingly restrictive through the 20th century, particularly on public and federal lands. Removing plants, mushrooms, or other natural materials from national parks, national forests, and state lands was prohibited or heavily restricted. That landscape is changing. The USDA Forest Service has expanded personal use foraging allowances on national forest lands. Many state parks have followed suit with designated foraging areas or relaxed enforcement policies for personal quantities. Urban foraging ordinances in cities like Seattle, Los Angeles, and Portland have also shifted toward allowance rather than prohibition. The Depression generation's knowledge of what grows wild and what's edible in their region was a genuine lifeline. That knowledge, in the hands of the right people today, still is. The eighth trick is beekeeping. During the Depression, honeybees were as valuable as gold. Honey was a sweetener, a preservative, a medicine, and a trade commodity. Beeswax had dozens of practical applications. Many families kept hives as a matter of course. Beekeeping was effectively banned or severely restricted in most American cities through the latter 20th century, classified alongside livestock. The urban beekeeping revival began in earnest around 2010, with New York City famously legalizing it that year after a lengthy advocacy campaign. Today, the majority of major American cities permit residential beekeeping with reasonable restrictions on hive number and placement. Beekeeping produces honey, yes, but it also pollinates your garden, provides beeswax for candles, salves, and preservation, and the hive itself is a source of extraordinary food security. Depression-era beekeepers understood this in their bones. The ninth trick is rabbit raising. Rabbits were the quiet protein powerhouse of the Depression era. A doe rabbit can produce up to 8 kits per litter and have multiple litters per year. Rabbit meat is lean, high in protein, and can be raised in a very small space on relatively little food, including kitchen scraps and garden trimmings. Like chickens, rabbits were pushed out of residential zones as livestock laws tightened. The good news is that rabbits occupy a legal gray area in many jurisdictions. Many city zoning codes that restrict chickens don't specifically mention rabbits, and a growing number of municipalities have explicitly added rabbits to their list of permissible residential animals. Check your local ordinances, because in a surprising number of places, raising meat rabbits in your backyard is completely legal and largely unregulated. This is a Depression-era protein solution that still works perfectly today. The 10th trick is medicinal herb growing and use. During the Depression, professional medical care was financially out of reach for most families. People relied on home remedies that drew from a rich tradition of herbal medicine that stretched back centuries. Elderberry for immune support, yarrow for wound treatment, plantain as a drawing poultice, valerian for sleep, garlic as an antibiotic. These weren't folk superstitions. Many of them have since been validated by clinical research. The 20th century saw a significant push by the medical and pharmaceutical establishment to delegitimize and restrict herbal medicine. While the FDA still regulates health claims that can be made about herbs and supplements, the fundamental legal right to grow medicinal herbs, to use them personally, and to share knowledge about traditional uses has been consistently protected. The growing integrative medicine movement, changes in how the FDA categorizes certain herbal preparations, and a general cultural shift back toward natural wellness have all combined to restore much of the legal and social legitimacy that Depression-era herbal medicine once held. The 11th trick is home distillation. Now, I want to be careful here because this one is still legally complex and varies significantly by jurisdiction. But here's the history. During Prohibition, which overlapped with the early Depression years, distilling spirits at home was federally banned. Prohibition ended in 1933, but federal law continued to ban home distillation of spirits, even as home brewing of beer and winemaking were eventually legalized for personal use. However, the landscape has been quietly shifting. Several states have enacted laws creating pathways for small-scale craft distillers and, in some cases, home distillers to operate legally. The knowledge of distillation beyond making spirits is also directly applicable to water purification, herbal distillation for essential oils, and home production of apple cider vinegar and other fermented products. The Depression generation used distillation in all of these ways. Know your state's laws, but understand that this knowledge base is experiencing a quiet legal revival in parts of the country. The 12th trick is composting and natural fertilizing. During the Depression, nothing organic was wasted. Kitchen scraps, human waste, animal manure, wood ash, all of it went back into the garden. Modern municipal regulations, particularly in dense urban areas, at various points restricted outdoor composting due to concerns about pests and odors. Some HOA covenants banned compost bins entirely. That tide has dramatically turned. Today, composting is not just legal in virtually every U.S. jurisdiction, but actively encouraged with municipal programs, free compost bin distributions, and tax incentives in some states. California even mandates organic waste diversion, effectively requiring composting. The Depression-era understanding that your soil is your wealth, and that you feed your soil with your waste, is now being rediscovered by mainstream agriculture and urban gardening. If you're not composting, you're throwing away fertility. The 13th trick is off-grid power. Depression-era homesteaders in rural areas often generated their own electricity long before utility lines reached them, using small windmills, water wheels, and later early photovoltaic experiments. As the electrical grid expanded through the mid-20th century, utility companies lobbied successfully for regulations that effectively required grid connection in many jurisdictions and made selling power back to the grid illegal or practically impossible for small producers. Net metering laws, which allow homeowners with solar panels or small wind turbines to sell excess power back to the grid, were non-existent until the 1980s and remained rare until the 2000s. Today, net metering is available in some form in the majority of U.S. states. The federal investment tax credit has made solar installation financially accessible to a much broader range of households. And the concept of going fully off-grid, generating all your own power and having no utility connection at all, is now legally recognized and protected in most rural jurisdictions. The Depression-era instinct to generate your own power rather than depending on a system that can fail is now a viable and increasingly mainstream choice. The 14th trick is bartering and informal trade. During the Depression, money was scarce but need was not. Communities survived on informal economies of exchange. A neighbor with an apple tree traded bushels of apples for a neighbor with a milk cow's extra dairy. Skills were traded for food. Labor was traded for shelter. The rise of formal tax structures and reporting requirements in the latter 20th century created legal gray areas around barter that made many people nervous. The IRS does technically require that the fair market value of bartered goods be reported as income, but the practical reality is that informal community exchange, trading homegrown food, traded labor, neighbor-to-neighbor skill sharing, has never been banned and continues to exist in a practical legal space that is largely untouched for small personal transactions. Local time banks, tool libraries, community gardens, and skill-sharing networks are the modern descendants of Depression-era barter communities. They are legal, they are growing, and they are precisely the kind of community resilience infrastructure that the Depression generation built out of pure necessity. The 15th trick is home animal slaughter. This one is difficult for many modern sensibilities, but it was absolutely standard during the Depression. Families raised pigs, cattle, and chickens specifically to slaughter for their own food supply. Home slaughter for personal consumption has never actually been illegal at the federal level. The Federal Humane Methods of Slaughter Act applies to commercial slaughterhouses, not to personal, on-farm slaughter for the owner's household. However, state regulations in some jurisdictions created significant barriers. The recent trend in farm-to-table awareness, local food movements, and small-scale farming advocacy has resulted in clearer legal protections for home and small farm slaughter for personal consumption in most states. Knowing how to humanely and efficiently process an animal for food is one of the most important survival skills that has been almost entirely lost in modern America. The Depression generation knew it without thinking. Relearning it is not just practical. It's a profound connection to the reality of where food actually comes from. The 16th trick is root cellaring and passive food storage. Depression families kept root cellars because electricity was expensive or unavailable. A properly constructed root cellar maintains temperatures between 32 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity levels that allow vegetables, fruits, preserved foods, and root crops to last for months without any mechanical refrigeration whatsoever. Building codes in many municipalities, particularly suburban areas, made underground structures and modifications to existing structures technically challenging from a permit perspective. The modern homesteading and survivalism movements, along with changing interpretations of residential building codes in many counties, have created much clearer pathways for homeowners to build root cellars, underground pantries, and passive cold storage spaces. Even without a traditional dugout cellar, the Depression-era practice of using cool, dark interior spaces, covering crops with sand or straw, and understanding the specific storage requirements of different crops is entirely legal, practically free, and can dramatically extend your food security. The 17th trick is wild game hunting and trapping for survival. Depression-era families in rural areas hunted and trapped as a primary food source, not as a sport. Rabbits, squirrels, deer, wild turkey, and fish were not recreation. They were dinner. Hunting and trapping regulations became increasingly complex through the 20th century. Bag limits, season restrictions, licensing requirements, and land access issues created a legal framework that many people found intimidating. None of that is wrong. Wildlife management regulations exist for good reasons and protect game populations, but the fundamental right to hunt and trap for food on legally permitted public lands and private lands with permission has never gone away. In fact, many states have recently made licensing easier and cheaper, expanded public hunting land access, and in some cases created specific provisions recognizing subsistence hunting as distinct from sport hunting. Learning to hunt and trap is a Depression-era survival skill that is entirely legal, actively encouraged in most states, and could be the difference between eating and starving in a prolonged crisis. The 18th trick is herbal pest control and natural farming. Depression farmers had no access to the synthetic pesticides that became standard after World War II. They used companion planting, pyrethrin sprays made from chrysanthemum flowers, copper sulfate fungicide washes, and physical pest control methods that were entirely natural. When synthetic pesticides became dominant in the 1950s and onward, the EPA began regulating pesticide use, including some naturally derived compounds, in ways that created confusion about what home gardeners could legally use. The organic farming movement, backed now by USDA certification standards, has clarified and protected the use of approved natural pest control methods in gardening and small-scale farming. Many Depression-era techniques, neem oil, diatomaceous earth, copper-based fungicides, beneficial insect cultivation, physical barriers, are fully legal, recognized by the USDA, and in many cases more effective than synthetic alternatives for home garden use. The Depression generation didn't have a choice about going natural. We do, but the choice they were forced to make turns out to have been the right one. The 19th trick is natural water sourcing and well digging. During the Depression, families who lived without municipal water systems dug wells or used natural spring sources. Today, well drilling is regulated in all 50 states, for good reason, as groundwater contamination is a genuine public health concern. However, the right to access groundwater on your own property for personal use has been consistently upheld in most jurisdictions. More recently, the framework for small, hand-dug or driven wells for personal use has been clarified in many states, with specific provisions for emergency and off-grid water systems. Knowing how to identify groundwater, how to evaluate spring sources, how to test water quality, and how to construct basic filtration systems is Depression-era knowledge that the modern prepper and homesteader community is actively working to restore. In an era of aging municipal water infrastructure and increasing drought, this knowledge is not paranoid. It is prudent. The 20th trick is community mutual aid. This is perhaps the most powerful Depression-era survival strategy of all, and it was never banned in the way that some of the other items on this list were. But it was systematically discouraged through a culture that increasingly emphasized individual consumerism over collective resilience. Depression communities formed mutual aid societies, barn-raising cooperatives, food banks, skill-sharing networks, and informal care systems that kept the most vulnerable members of their communities alive. The legal landscape around nonprofit mutual aid organizations, community land trusts, food co-ops, and informal community resilience networks has been progressively clarified and protected. The COVID-19 pandemic saw an explosion of new mutual aid networks across the United States, and many of them are still operating and growing. The Depression generation didn't call it prepping or survivalism. They called it being a good neighbor, and it saved more lives than any individual survival technique on this list. The 21st trick is small-scale aquaponics and fish raising. Depression families near water supplemented their diets with fish, and those with available pond space raised catfish, perch, and other species in contained ponds. The combination of fish cultivation and vegetable growing, now known as aquaponics, is an extraordinarily efficient food production system. Zoning laws in many areas either banned or created uncertainty around small-scale fish cultivation and the structures associated with it. Recent changes at both state and local levels have increasingly recognized aquaponics as a form of urban agriculture and created specific regulatory categories that permit residential and small commercial aquaponics operations. The Depression-era principle of using fish both as a food source and as a natural fertilizer for food crops, which is essentially what aquaponics codifies, is being rediscovered as one of the most efficient land-use food production methods available. The 22nd trick is natural building and repair. Depression families fixed and built things themselves. They knew how to work with wood, stone, clay, and lime. They plastered walls with natural materials. They built simple structures with hand tools and local materials. Building codes through the 20th century, while essential for structural safety, created complex permit requirements and minimum standards that effectively made many traditional building techniques illegal in regulated construction. The growth of the natural building movement, including cob, straw bale, adobe, and timber framing construction, has led to changes in many state and local building codes to accommodate these techniques under specific conditions. Some states, including California, New Mexico, and Arizona, have developed specific code pathways for traditional and natural building methods. Knowing how to repair, build, and maintain structures without depending on professional contractors or industrial materials is a survival skill that the Depression generation possessed as a matter of course, and that we have largely surrendered over the past 70 years. The 23rd trick is natural textile production and mending. Depression-era households raised fiber animals, primarily sheep and rabbits, spun yarn, wove cloth, and most importantly, mended everything. The throwaway culture of the late 20th century, combined with the collapse of domestic textile production, made mending and natural textile production economically irrational in normal times. There are no legal restrictions on home spinning, weaving, fiber animal raising, or garment mending, of course. But the skill set has been so completely lost in most American households that it might as well have been banned. Organizations dedicated to fiber arts, the growing homesteading community, and a broader cultural shift towards sustainability are reviving these skills. Knowing how to produce, repair, and maintain your own clothing and textile goods, from the fiber level up, is a survival capability that could be significant in a prolonged disruption to supply chains. The 24th trick is fire making and fire management. Depression families understood fire in a way that most modern Americans simply don't. They knew how to start fires without modern ignition tools. They knew how to manage cooking fires for efficiency. They knew how to safely contain, control, and extinguish fires. They understood fire behavior well enough to prevent house fires in homes where open flames were a daily reality. Teaching fire-making skills, particularly primitive fire starting, using friction methods, flint and steel, and natural tinders, fell into a strange legal gray area for many years, particularly in school settings where it was treated as dangerous content. That attitude has reversed in many contexts. Wilderness survival programs, scouting movements, outdoor education curricula, and the broader primitive skills revival have all normalized fire-making knowledge. Understanding fire, how to create it, control it, cook with it, heat with it, and prevent it from destroying what you're trying to protect, is foundational survival knowledge that the Depression generation took for granted. The 25th trick, and perhaps the most quietly powerful one of all, is the practice of community-level food production and communal gardening. During the Depression, the Victory Garden movement that followed was actually a scaled-up version of the community survival gardens that Depression communities had already been running out of pure need. Neighbors sharing plots, sharing labor, sharing harvests. Community gardens existed informally in vacant lots, along railroad easements, on church grounds, and in every available green space. Through much of the mid to late 20th century, the legal status of community gardens in urban areas was uncertain. Liability concerns, zoning restrictions, and land use regulations created barriers. That has dramatically changed. Today, community gardens are not just legally recognized in most jurisdictions, but actively supported through city planning, municipal grants, and nonprofit frameworks. New York City's Green Thumb program manages over 500 community gardens. Similar programs exist in Chicago, Los Angeles, Boston, Seattle, and hundreds of smaller cities. The Depression-era understanding that growing food together is not just more efficient, but also more resilient and more community-binding than growing alone, is one of the most important truths being rediscovered by the modern urban resilience movement. So here's where we land. 25 survival skills, skills that kept people alive during the worst economic collapse in American history. Skills that were subsequently restricted, regulated, or culturally buried as America became wealthier, more urbanized, and more dependent on industrial systems for every basic need. And skills that are now, quietly and without fanfare, being legally restored and culturally revived because a growing number of people, and apparently a growing number of lawmakers, understand that a society where people can't feed themselves, can't heat their homes, can't collect water, can't preserve food, can't raise animals, and can't work together without a corporate intermediary is a society that is one serious crisis away from catastrophe. The people who lived through the Great Depression didn't have the luxury of forgetting these things. They couldn't afford to. We've had 70 years of relative prosperity to forget, and most of us use that time very efficiently. But the knowledge doesn't have to stay forgotten. Every single one of these 25 skills is learnable. Most of them are legal wherever you live, or legal in nearby rural areas accessible to you. Many of them are legal in your own backyard right now today, whether you live in a city, a suburb, or in the country. At Forgotten Survival Code, this is exactly what we're about. Digging up the skills, the knowledge, and the strategies that sustained human life before the systems we all depend on existed. Not because we think those systems are going to collapse tomorrow, but because the people who built those systems knew things we've forgotten. And the Depression generation, who watched those systems fail completely and then built something out of nothing using their own hands and their own communities, those people have more to teach us than we ever gave them credit for. Here's what I want you to do right now. Think about which of these 25 skills you're the furthest from. Which one represents the biggest gap between where you are today and where the Depression generation was by necessity? Is it water? Is it food production? Is it heating? Is it community? Pick the biggest gap, and I want you to drop it in the comments below. Because not only does that help me understand what content will be most useful to you on this channel, it's also going to create a conversation in those comments that might connect you with other people who are working on the same thing in your area. Community was the Depression generation's greatest survival tool. There's no reason it can't be ours too. And if this video opened your eyes to something you hadn't thought about before, do one thing for me. Share it. Send it to a family member, post it to a group, text it to a friend who you think would get something out of it. Because the whole point of Forgotten Survival Code is to get this information to as many people as possible before they need it rather than after. The Depression generation didn't have the internet. They didn't have YouTube. They learned these things because someone sat down with them, face to face, and passed the knowledge on. This video is our version of that. Help us pass it on. I'll see you in the next one.